Hello! This week we're going through a little bit of a change of pace. We're going from what makes a great teacher and becoming a teacher, exciting topics, to residential schools. And it's a bit jarring, but I wanted to do residential schools this week because Wednesday is Orange Shirt Day. The day where we wear orange shirts, like this one, to remember residential schools and to remember the survivors of residential schools. And so, yes, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a shock. Going from something that's so uplifting to something that is one of the greatest blights on Canadian history. And so this week, that's what we're talking about. And if you haven't watched the videos yet, I want you to stop this video and watch the two short videos that are on the D2L site. It'd be good to do the readings as well. They're very light. The TRC calls to action is 11 pages long. And the other document is intended for classrooms, intermediate grade students, and so has a lot of pictures and is a fairly easy read, although the topic is very heavy. So we'll stop here for a second and I'll let you do that, and then we'll get back to this video. Okay, so before we get started, I want to go over some of the terminology. When we're talking about Indigenous people in Canada, we use a variety of terms. The first term that I'd like to talk about is Aboriginal. That's a term that's used by the federal government. And so if you're ever going to do any research and you're looking for government policies or government reports, use the word Aboriginal to look it up. Aboriginal isn't a word that we use very much anymore. It's a word that came originally from Australia and, quite frankly, was used as a derogatory term. The next word or term that we're going to use is used by the Ontario government, and it's FNMI, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. All school documents typically refer to FNMI. Now, the provincial government has started to use the term Indigenous. So in schools, we no longer have an FNMI lead. We have an Indigenous lead supporting schools. Which brings us to the term Indigenous. Indigenous, we typically use that word in academic circles. It's a broad, inclusive term. You can tell by the way that I talk, it's my preferred term to use. It's problematic because it's so inclusive, it makes it difficult to discriminate between groups. And so it is somewhat problematic, and when you use the word Indigenous, it treats Indigenous people as though they are a homogeneous group, and they're not. They're very, very diverse. And so it too is a problematic term, but being an academic, I like to include as many people as I can. And quite frankly, as a teacher, I like to include as many people as I can. So that's my preferred term. Native. So Native is still used by Indigenous peoples. It's often a preferred term because it distinguishes from Métis and Inuit. It also is used by the same type of people that would use First Nation. And then the final term is Indian. And I'm sure you all know Indian is a term that came from, Chris Columbus. When he first landed on this shore, he thought he was in India when he first came ashore in North America. And once again, bit of a derogatory term. We're using, the confusion of a European guy to define the indigenous peoples in North and South America. But it's an important term to know, especially if you're looking things up, because many indigenous people have reclaimed the term Indian. And it's used in rap and as a form of resistance. So those are great terms for you to know when you're doing research and you're trying to find different types of documents. And now I want to turn to residential schools. This slide has the logo from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was started as a way of exploring and investigating the residential schools history and abuse, and was an act by the Canadian government to start down the path of reconciliation between our two peoples, between the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who suffered in residential schools, and Canada. And so I've put the logo there, that it came to a conclusion in 2015, and this is still something that we are actively working on. It's something that we as a university are engaged in responding to the calls of action put out by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Public schools are mandated to respond to the calls to action, but it's a long path, and it doesn't change the past. And part of that is for us to remember and to acknowledge this tragedy, what the TRC called cultural genocide on the Indigenous people of Canada. You can see some of the things that I wrote down here. Residential schools were a horrible place. That's not to say that there weren't some priests or teachers in residential school that did their best to help Indigenous children. But the pedagogy of Indigenous schools took the assumption that Indigenous people and Indigenous children were less than their European counterparts, than their Canadian counterparts. This pedagogy leads naturally to all sorts of atrocities because the Indigenous children were not seen as human. And it's important for us to think about that Indigenous schools used pedagogy and teaching practices that they thought were ethical and right and a way of civilizing the children. Now, it also created the climate for predators. And so I'm not saying in the least that some of the crimes that were committed were pedagogical choices by the teachers. Now, even though it is in the past, this is a reconciliation that we're still coming to terms with. The federal government apologized in 2008 for residential schools. There have been reparations paid to residential school survivors, but the Canadian government still has not recognized residential schools and several other government policies and practices as cultural genocide. As a society, we still face, as you could tell in the second video, Indigenous people still face all sorts of systemic racism and hurdles to their education and success within schools and society. And so it brings me to a question. Every year, I have students for whom this is the first time they had heard about residential schools. And so I ask, were you taught about residential schools as a student? I hope the answer is yes. But if not, why not? Next week, we're going to be talking more positively about Indigenous education and what you can do in your classroom. Because as teachers, we have the ability to make a difference in the lives of our students. We have the ability to share residential schools and the story of residential schools with the children in our classrooms. With kindergarten students, we're not going to talk about the sexual and physical abuse endured by residential school students. But we can talk about how children were forcibly removed from their families. We can talk about how they weren't allowed to speak their language. We can talk about how children had their hair cut and forced to wear clothes that were not their traditional clothes, and separated brother from sister, even though they were both in the same residential school. Regardless of how old your students are, they can all understand how that is unfair. And you can include, as a teacher, FM&I practices, Indigenous practices in your classroom so that Indigenous students can feel comfortable and at home, and so that all your students can benefit from Indigenous practices. It can be something as simple as introducing sharing circles into your daily practice or weekly practice, or inviting an elder or a knowledge keeper into your classroom. Acknowledging the land that we walk on is not our own, but that we are guests here. As teachers, you can choose to make a difference. You will choose a different pedagogy than the ones used by residential schools. You can work towards creating an inclusive classroom where all children are valued and all children can succeed and excel. That is the power that you have as a teacher. So in class this week, we're going to be talking about residential schools. And we're going to be talking about Indigenous education. It's going to be a little heavier than it normally is, but that's okay. I will do my best to create a safe place for us to talk about this. And I want you to feel comfortable. This isn't something that I want you to feel guilt about, or shame, or quite frankly, anger. I think that it is important for us to acknowledge the past, the good with the bad, and to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Anyhow, I'm looking forward to our discussion in class.